Antony, welcome to the Tech First Talks podcast.
Morning, Charles. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really looking forward to this because we get to talk about three of my favorite topics from the recent years, which is PropTech, the future of work, and GenAI. But before we delve into this, why don't you tell the audience a bit about your background and how somebody who started out studying history and the history of art got to where you are today?
It's a function of age, Charles. If you're old enough to have been off to university before there was any such thing as the internet or mobile phones or whatnot, you had a different conception of what would be interesting to do as a degree. And I actually did history and history of art and actually worked for one of the leading European art dealers in London for 10 years or so. But what happened at that time was a lot of art dealers were involved in the real estate world, and a lot of art dealers were involved with property development. And then to cut a long story short, we ended up in 1995, and I happened to go into what was then the first internet cafe in the UK. It always makes me laugh when I tell certain young people this, that you actually had to go to a shop to use the internet and in the old days, and just thought this would be really interesting for real estate because we got lots of documents, we got lots of people and lots of images, and everyone's all over the place, sort of perfect for the internet. So I actually started the first commercial real estate website in the UK in 1995, and then ran a web agency for 10 years, essentially teaching myself because there was so little you could do on the internet in those days. Even a history of art graduate could learn it. So I did that for 10 years, and then I ended up doing a joint venture with the largest real estate company in the UK, developing property management software. And I did that for 10 plus years. And then the last decade or so, I've mainly focused on writing, speaking, doing advisory work. And then for the last 4 years, I've been teaching online courses about the future of real estate. And for the last 2 years, teaching a course about generative AI for real estate people.
That's a fascinating journey, and especially because you were doing PropTech before the phrase had even been coined. So you're definitely one of the early adopters in this space. So you've got to see it grow over the years. What do you think about the current state of it now? Because there was a big buzz around it, maybe like 7 or 8 years ago, but now it seems to have cooled down a bit. So what's your take?
Well, I'm not so sure it's cooled down. Yes, there was a super bubble a couple of years ago into all of this stuff, but I think probably today is the best time to be in PropTech ever. My principal background is in the office market and the commercial market. But if you focus on the office market, the only way you will create an investable now is to have a highly sophisticated tech-enabled building, because the only way you create an investable office asset now is to create a great user experience for the people in there. And the only way to do that is to have the technological capabilities within the building that enable it to produce the right type of environment and user experience. So whether the real estate industry likes it or not, and to be fair, it likes it more than it used to, but it still doesn't like technology in the way that some other industries like technology. It really doesn't have a choice but to really lean into technology now. And it often comes back to, well, that's what the customer wants. And eventually, when the customer wants something, the supplier has to change. And that's what's happening in real estate now. The customer profile and nature of demand is changing, and the industry is going to have to change, and they're going to need a lot of tech to do it.
And they're not just dipping their toe in the water, because if you look at the bigger firms, JLLs, the CBREs, they're throwing hundreds of millions of dollars at technology investments right now, and investing a lot in startups as well. So not just acquiring larger firms, they're going really early stage. Do you think they're getting the most out of it right now, or are they still in that learning process?
They have the typical large company pluses and minuses. They have the money, they have the scale, they can amortize costs over the whole globe and over a number of years, and big numbers don't look so big when you're that scale. The problem is, as with all big companies, they actually tend to end up in silos. And I was talking to someone the other day saying, I don't understand why X of these companies you just mentioned isn't able to get better distribution for the companies it's invested in. Because going back to when I had my joint venture with British Land, we would literally finish some software on a Friday and stick it in the buildings on a Monday. Immediately, we went in and across the board and just put it out there and help people use it. Why doesn't that happen in these big companies? They've got tentacles across the globe. They should be able to take a company from zero to hero in like a nanosecond. Well, it doesn't actually work like that, because you think you're dealing with one company, but you're actually probably dealing with like 3,000 companies. and 3,000 contracts. And everybody has their own major customer, for instance, who's big enough that is like an entity on their own. And you can't just tell the central body, can't just tell them we'll use this new software. And so you have this perception of having incredible distribution. It doesn't necessarily happen like that in reality.
It's not just the commercial real estate firms. I think that's any large corporate. They've got their different lines of businesses. They operate independently, and they're not always the easiest to work for. They try to protect their own patch of land. But I think also the silo problem we have is in a lot of the technologies they've invested in. They've got a lot of individual point solutions that, yes, can solve problems, but they come in there and person who can do one solution comes in and tries to sell it. And the next one, it's not a unified approach. And they don't have a platform play where they can go to the client saying, listen, here's our platform, check off the ones you want to add and we can do those for you. It's almost like an individual thing. So I think it's still a little bit fragmented that way.
This is a really interesting thing, and I've been doing quite a lot of work on this the last few weeks. There's a chap called Paul Sangeet Chowdhury, who wrote a book called Platform Revolution a number of years ago, and has written some really interesting strategic ideas about the impact of generative AI on business. And he talks about how workflows and jobs are becoming unbundled. So we're having little point solutions to deal with the 20 tasks we have to do for our jobs. And so they get unbundled and lots of stuff can get siphoned off to be dealt with by the machines. But his attitude is that's all very well. At some stage, you've got to rebundle into creating new sources of value. Because if you think about it at the moment, I tell everyone on my course that I think they've got 12 to 18 months to really make hay using these new tools because they are ahead of the market. But in 18 months, 2 years' time, everyone's going to have the same tools. And then competitive advantage just disappears. Yeah, everyone produces a better service, but there's no advantage in producing a better service. So where are the new sources of value? Where's the new control points? And this is exactly what you were just talking about, turning silos into ecosystems. And three of the ways that there's going to be enormous opportunities to create new values are companies that are going to be able to do that holistic view of data. So they don't just have data on this or that, they have data on all of it, and they can pull in party data, second party data, third party data, and they have an overview of it. And then also people who can orchestrate all these siloed tools. So if you go into the basement of any commercial office building, you'll probably see a row of 10 PCs lined up, each showing a dashboard, which is 10 different silos. So this orchestration over the top of all those silos. And then we're moving into a world where each of us will be using agents to do some of these things. The ability to orchestrate the environment is going to be a super skill. And then the third point is if you can then add a layer of trust on top of that orchestration, so you've got data, orchestration, and trust, you've suddenly got a completely new value proposition, which isn't beholden on doing what you used to do better, faster, cheaper, but is offering something that is genuinely new and enabled by the new technology. So bye-bye silos is hopefully going to be the answer.
But the industry, we love silos. They're so much fun. And I know what you're talking about because what the concept is creating a platform of platforms. And I remember looking at this about, must have been 8 or 10 years ago. There was a UK company called Demand Logic. And they could go in there and aggregate all the different building management systems into a single platform. And it was brilliant. And it was doing very well in the UK. But we tried to bring it into Asia. And the problem was those same vendors that they were aggregating in the UK wouldn't allow you access to that data in Asia. They wanted to charge you again for it if you wanted to use it again, which was just ridiculous. So I think the industry held itself back there. But this is what we need. We need data and an overview across the top of everything. And you're right, the tertiary data that you can pull in from other sources, that'll allow you to make a lot more interesting business decisions going forward.
Yeah. It's interesting. I had a long chat with one of the language models a few weeks ago, and it was based on one of those very large real estate services companies had produced a diagram of the companies they work with to provide services within a commercial building. And I had this long conversation with one of these models saying, well, would you actually buy any of those? And the long and the short of it was, no, I wouldn't buy any of those. What I'd buy is all these new people that are coming into the market, and I plug them together. And I think this is something that is under contemplated at the moment. The advantages to small companies and startups today is probably greater than ever because, and I think we're going to talk about it later, this new study that's come out, which says that, nothing works, 95% of Gen AI investments fail. We'll come on to that. But one of the reasons, of course, is that you're dealing with this whole commercial inertia and misaligned incentives and all that sort of stuff, as opposed to companies starting from scratch, clean sheet of paper, no legacy, but with extraordinarily powerful tools to play with. I can see a very bifurcated world coming up where a lot of the world actually does move very slowly, as is the norm with the introduction of new technologies. In reality, they take decades to come in. But you're going to get this parallel world of companies growing really fast, doing extraordinary things and being incredibly competitive. That's going to be an interesting world to be in. We're already seeing it, of course, with some of these tech companies like Lovable and Cursor and whatever going to 0 to 100 million supposed annual revenue in a matter of months with very few people.
But they don't have the legacy infrastructure that they have to build around. They can start from scratch and they can solve a problem from today. If you wanted to create a solution to solve one of these problems today, you wouldn't build it the way you've got your infrastructure built. You'd start from scratch. You'd leverage the cloud. And that's why people in a lot of these companies, they're creating these companies to go after traditional industries. Whether it's ERP systems, PMS systems, they can go after it in a very lean organization and offer it for a fraction of the price.
Yeah.
But can they get the trust? That's the next thing.
Yes, that's clearly a problem. But it's also an interesting situation as well. This is where the Americans are very good, that there's plenty of capital around to throw at companies doing things like that. Whereas particularly you come to Europe and you say you want to take on an incumbent and they go, dear boy, they've been around 100 years, go away, come back when you've got a better idea. Asia, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar enough to know.
Depends country by country.
Right. It varies country by country. But yes, there's clearly trust. This trust thing, I think, needs to be something that companies over-index on and that they consider as fundamental to their brand. And this applies to real estate developers as well. So for instance, you take an office building. If I want to provide a fantastic user experience to Charles when he comes into my building, I need to know a lot about Charles. I need to know when he comes in, why he comes in, what does he do, who does he meet, where does he like to do it, what temperature does he like, what noise does he like, what view does he like. I need to know tons about you. And then if I do know tons about you, I can point you to the space in my building, which is perfectly set up to provide you with the space as a service that you need. But the problem in many cases is going to be that the Charleses of the world will, no, bugger off. I'm not giving you my information. That's true. The person wanting the information in order to provide a great service has to be upfront about what the trade is. So, Charles, I want all this information off you. And in return, I'm going to give you X. And this is how I'm going to treat your data. This is how I'm going to not sell it to. And this is how I'm not going to behave like Mark Zuckerberg. Please, can we proceed?
It's definitely the right way to do it. Unfortunately, most companies or cities aren't willing to do that because that involves transparency. And let's face it, they don't know what they're going to do with the data yet. They want to capture it. But there's been some examples where people have gone through and been transparent with the ethical use and disposal of the data they collect. Most companies don't do that today just because that costs time and money and people don't want to spend time and money on it. But you're right on this. I mean, that's missing from the industry. You talked about the funding. I think one of the things that shocked me moving back to Europe is how risk averse everybody is when it comes to anything with startups and innovation. There's also a lack of a VC ecosystem here. If you give any startup in Europe or the UK or Asia the chance to take money from Silicon Valley or local, they're going to go Silicon Valley because that gets them to the right markets to grow. So these are some of the things that are missing.
We're actually not too bad with seed money. We're very bad with scale-up money. So when you suddenly need not a couple of million, 20, 50, 100 million, that's where it all goes wrong. And then everyone, just as you say, decamps and moves to America. But
So that's something that happened in Singapore as well. They spent a lot of money bringing in venture capital firms to create an innovative culture and startup environment. And it was great because you had people who were doing seed and series A, maybe even a B. They didn't have the higher end of B, C, D that gets these companies to really scale and grow. It created an environment where we suddenly had too many startups and there was no scalability and no money to make them scale.
why was that? Because I would have thought the attitude in Singapore would have been amenable to, and it's not short of money out there.
It's a whole separate thing because a lot of these startups that they had, it was easy to get money. So you had too many startups already, which I think they just needed to clean house a little bit. Second thing is if you're based in Singapore, it's very difficult to show that your startup can scale internationally. Because
Yeah.
while you're in Southeast Asia, which is hundreds of millions of people, probably like 650, 700 million people, they're all different markets. And if something sells in Singapore, it's priced out of the rest of the markets.
Yeah.
So then where do you go and sell to? And there's a whole laundry list of reasons why the VC industry hurt there, but there's definitely room for improvement. But I think like we're seeing that other things coming together. Give me your one top thing. If you could fix one thing with PropTech right now, just wave a magic wand, what would it be?
I'm going to be greedy and put two together. One on the buy side would be that there are people in the large companies who are well into this, but they're not quite in the positions of power yet. I would like them to be in the positions of power. And the second thing actually goes back to what we're talking about with silos, that there was a much stronger focus on providing a total solution for someone rather than giving a buyer just one other bloody check that they've got to sign. You know, you need to go and solve 10 problems or build an ecosystem that you can go and sell en masse. A bit like in construction, you know, a main contractor goes in there. They don't all have the sub trades, you know, but they have the ecosystem to pull them all together. I would like to essentially see more aggression and more leaning into the future rather than being terrified of upsetting the past.
Very good. So now it's time to move on to another one of your passion areas, which is space as a service. So you coined this buzzword probably 7, 8 years ago. Can you explain what this actually means to the industry?
That's really the concept behind this. And I actually started, I think it was almost 13 years ago that I first started writing about it. And it was the sort of earliest days of the flex market. Okay, the likes of Regis have been around a long time before, but the sort of idea of, you know, the early WeWork days.
Mhm.
In defense of WeWork, they did lots of very stupid things, and their leader in chief is half a lunatic, but they did lots of really good things as well. And they're still probably the most important real estate company of the last 20 years in terms of how they changed the market. They're the Teslas of real estate, really. They defined a product that didn't exist
And ended
before.
out hated at the end.
Well, yeah, in both cases, in many ways. It's something that's built up over time that 10 years ago, there was a growing market for these types of spaces. And actually, London has actually been, for a long time, the highest percentage to the wants, needs, and desires of the individuals who use the building. But it's a completely different mindset to the traditional real estate company. Because you've got to remember, the office market up until not that long ago, and to an extent still the case, is a market to create a product for investors. It was for a long time not a business that really had any interest in the customer. The idea was to create something that could be turned into a financial product that could be sold to investors. Hence, a 20-year lease with upward-only rent reviews becomes a bond. So offices were bonds. Now they're businesses. And a business now has to pay attention to its customer. Previously, they never had to pay attention to its customer. And even though people like me criticize them for it, that was the sensible thing to do. You didn't need to pay any attention to your customer. They signed a 20-year lease. They've got to pay. They ain't going anywhere. You don't have to do anything for them as long as you sold your investment. Now it's completely the opposite. You will not get a quality customer unless you can provide a space that provides an excellent user experience. And you won't create a great investment without creating a building that enables a great user experience. The market has actually turned completely upside down, that it used to be all about the investor. Obviously, it's still all about money. At the end of the day, you know, you need money in these places and you've got to sell them. But fundamentally, it's about the occupier now, as opposed to the investor. And this is chalk and cheese. It's not a small deal. It's a completely different industry.
But I think it's an exciting industry because what we're doing is really forcing their hand. Because yes, it still comes down to a money decision, but they don't have a choice. They need to create offices which are going to define, the future of work. Places where people want to go and spend time. And if I'm a company and I want to attract the best talent, I need a space that will help attract and retain that talent. So we're seeing it come full circle where the industry, the demand side is saying, I need this. So basically the supply side has to do it. And those people who don't do it, you'll still be able to rent a lot of your space. You won't get as much money for it, and it won't be the attractive premier customers that you really want to have in there.
I, I think maybe evidence is the issue here. And it's been the same thing in the flex market. It's been very hard for flex operators to have their spaces valued because there hasn't been enough evidence over a long enough period of time to justify them saying, yes, but we have these 14 different revenue sources, and over time, it averages out like this. You go to a hotel, average rate per night, et cetera, they know exactly how to price space that changes hands every single day in the hotel market. That's been a problem in the flex market, and still to quite a strong extent is for developers and landlords. I personally think the biggest impediment is investors. Investors do tend to be the most parochial, narrow-minded, this is how it's done here, sonny boy, people in the world. I remember giving a talk a couple of years ago at a private equity real estate conference, and I was talking about all these things. And then someone basically jumped up and said, yeah, but I'm on Google on a 15-year lease. And, basically that was it. I'm not interested. I'm on one of the great companies of the world on a really long lease. And they
And I
can't,
want to be 25 again. So get
yeah,
real.
they can't really see beyond that. I think what might happen, which could be really interesting, I think we're going to see new money into the industry. So money from different sources. And you already see this to an extent with some of the more offbeat and niche operators, particularly in sort of hospitality and leisure properties. You get a lot of high net worth individual family money, long-term money, private money going into those sorts of things. And they're happy to not to take a punt, but to believe in a project and think, well, it doesn't have to show a profit in 2 years. And I think, and I'm hoping, we're going to see a lot of new money coming into the industry, thinking, well, what we've got now is not what we need in the future, and we're going to need different types of spaces. My personal preference, I think mixed use developments are going to be really big, quite a large scale. So sort of, if you like, baby 15-minute cities, places where you can live, work, play, walk around, have everything at your fingertips under the control of one entity. I think there's going to be lots of scope for that. But that's a very old tradition. If you come to London, there's the Grosvenor estate, there's the Howard de Walden estate, and there's a few other estates. They've been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, and their areas tend to be really good because they're not selling anything. They're there for another few hundred years, and they're interested in developing a total space. So they can think of a whole space holistically. What retail do I need? What resi? What's commercial? I think we're going to see a lot of new money coming into these spaces that are either big and multi-use or that are going to over-index on humanity. There's clearly going to be a lot of money in providing luxury services for humans, and probably without technology. There might be tourism, might be natural things, spaces where you can just be human. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? The Soho house got bought last week. And I heard someone was punting on LinkedIn yesterday that they said, my bet is that Louis Vuitton buy them in 2 years. And that's an interesting concept. Human is the new luxury.
Well, it's also a good way to sell your wares because you have access then to a bunch of high net worth individuals. So it makes it easier. But I agree. Mixed use is where we need to go to next. But where we need to go to next is to start talking about GenAI.
Yep.
And it's been obviously a crazy few years for GenAI. I want to start out with the recent report from MIT and NANDA, where they came out and said that U.S. companies have invested somewhere between $35 and $40 billion in GenAI projects, and only about 5% of those are leading to rapid revenue growth or producing a lot of positives for the companies. So 95% fail rate is what the headline is. What's your take on this?
And more productive. And this is really from what, 1880 through to like 1920. So with that, it took 40 years for the design changes. And then productivity in the early 20s went absolutely ballistic in factories because they all got completely redesigned. I think the sheer process of needing to change your company to really leverage these tools is the fundamental problem. Then you've got the secondary problem of, particularly in America, the C-suite is very heavily incentivized to get rid of employees. If you sack a lot of employees in America, your share price goes up, you get richer. They're very heavily incentivized to replace people with capital. So there's been a lot of companies that have just used this and thought, well, how does this just make us more productive? How does this enable us to do what we do now faster and cheaper? And to an extent that will work, but it's a dead end. So I think it's all completely inevitable. But if you took those 5% and look what they were doing, I bet they're incredibly productive. There are certainly companies that are making incredible productivity gains out of this stuff.
See, I also was not surprised by this, the fact that 95% of GenAI projects fail. But for me, the surprise is from a different level. I've been using a stat in almost every presentation for the last 7 or 8 years, and it'll come from either BCG, Bain, McKinsey, Carney, about the percentage of digital transformations that fail. And it's always between 75 and 90%. I mean, the last one last year from Bain, it was 88%. So we can't do these things. We can't implement this type of change. Why would this be any different? What did we suddenly figure out? The other thing that's worrying is those consulting firms that keep showing those stats, they're the ones who are supposed to be delivering it. So what are they doing wrong that those numbers aren't improving? And we should be going back and asking them that. I think it's a great tool if it's applied correctly. And this is another good segue now, because now we get to go in to talk about what you do with GenAI and with commercial real estate.
I teach this course, a generative AI for real estate people course, which is focused on practitioners. It's not a technical course. It's focused on people working across the board within real estate. So what we pay a lot of attention to is, first off, what is generative AI? People talk about AI and they don't realize it's not a singular thing. And generative AI is very different to predictive AI. There's analytical AI and there's creative AI, and they're different worlds. And it's very important to understand the difference. And then we spend actually a lot of time on frameworks about prompting. Stat that came out 2 weeks ago when OpenAI launched GPT-5, that Sam Altman put out that the 7% of paid users of ChatGPT ever used one of their reasoning models. Now, they've got their general non-reasoning models, and then from a year ago, they've got these new reasoning models. Models and non-reasoning models are absolutely chalk and cheese. It's a different world. It's a parallel universe. It exasperates me, and it happens a lot on LinkedIn. You'll get these sort of smart-arsey types saying, oh, well, I asked ChatGPT this, and it answered that. What a stupid thing it is. I just say, show me a way of telling the world you're an idiot without telling the world you're an idiot. Good prompting is the easiest way to get a high ROI on generative AI today. You get an absolutely different outcome from knowing how to prompt well. So we spend a lot of time setting people up with, we've actually now got 30 types of prompts, because I had to add 10 different types of prompt that you can do with GPT-5. But they're just frameworks, so you'll pick a few of them. So we do a lot on that. And then we concentrate a lot on, what is this going to mean for the real estate industry? How is this going to change the nature of the real estate industry? And this is what I was talking about earlier, the unbundling and rebundling of our work, and how's our work going to change? And then we do a big concentration on, what is this going to mean for the nature of demand? Because fundamentally, the demand equals customers equals our pay packets. So we do a lot on how it will affect the industry, how it's going to affect the nature of demand. And then we concentrate on just good use of the major tools. And as I say, I think you've got 12 to 18 months of being able to make hay, because you're just better at everything you want to do. You are better if you know how to use these tools effectively in the short term.
Okay. And I agree with you that if used effectively, you get fantastic results. If you know the questions to ask, the prompts to write, you can get fantastic results. We're going down this path where not everybody's learning how to use it. Projects are failing. What risk would this pose to the real estate industry if they don't learn how to harness it and really leverage it to drive their business going forward?
I keep coming back to that famous Ernest Hemingway thing of how did you go bankrupt? Slowly, then suddenly. Not a lot will change. And then you will start competing with these companies that have lent into this, that are working on a completely different cadence to you at a completely different rev speed and are capable of doing what you do twice as fast, 5 times as fast, 10 times as fast, and possibly a lot cheaper with a lot fewer people. And then you're suddenly going to find yourself very uncompetitive. Not going to happen immediately. Paths will cross over. And at some point, every time you go up for a piece of work, you're going to confront someone who's 5 to 10 times more productive than you, and you're not going to be able to compete.
I think what's going to happen is this is going to follow Amara's law, where we overestimate the importance in the near term and underestimate in the long term. We will be living fundamentally different lives 5 years from now because of this technology. And I think really that's where we're headed. But what about misconceptions? Like when people look at Gen AI, what's the biggest misconception that people have about it today?
The biggest misconception is people think, oh, whoopee, we can get it to do all the boring stuff and we can do all the interesting stuff. When you get good at these things and good at using them, you go, wow, you're not just here for the boring stuff, are you? If I don't very actively try and co-opt you as my thinking partner, then you will replace me because frankly, you know more than me. Most people think that they're just pieces of software that will do all the robotic process automation, but they won't. They're moving further and further up the value chain. One of the things I think is really important to understand, there's been a number of big research reports that have shown that these tools raise the bar for the average considerably in terms of people using these tools become more creative en masse. So it's really important for people to understand these things can help us all become more creative, but all that does is raise the general bar to become differentiated. We still need to do our human thinking and we still do need to do our human creativity. And then we need to merge the two in some way. There was a big study done by MIT in November last year where they did a meta study of 160 studies about the impact of AI on knowledge work. And they said it fits into two camps, augmentation and synergy. And augmentation is where it enables everyone to be better, but not better than the best person who possibly could have answered that question. But they said there's a category of question where you can get genuine synergy, where it can do things that coupled with what you can do, actually genuinely make 2 + 2 = 5. As an example, you might be an architect and you can now have 50 different floor plates immediately, as opposed to one. So you've got a lot more options, which is great, but you still need really good judgment to know that's the one you should pick.
And this is the key thing, because we're at a certain age, we know the questions to ask. And I think it's an incredible tool to help me do my job better. And to be honest, and the other use case for me is it allows me to compete at scale. So
Yeah.
I can do things now that I would need a team of minions underneath me working on before. I can do it all myself now by leveraging Gen AI. And it allows me to compete against larger firms and do projects that are bigger that way. What I'm also interested in is about how we always will still need the experts. Everyone says it's going to wipe out McKinsey. It's going to wipe out whoever. Those top people at McKinsey, they are such deep subject matter experts in their areas. They'll know the right questions to ask. And if they know how to do this, they'll be even better at it. So there's always going to be those people who will really be exceptional. Us, an average person just using it, we'll raise our bar a bit, but we'll still, like you said, be average.
There was a study that came out a couple of weeks ago that made a lot of people think these tools are making us more stupid because we're outsourcing all our intelligence to them. The possibility exists for lots of people just to outsource their thinking altogether. And then that's a very fast way to becoming completely obsolete and to become more stupid. But the skill and the ability to use your critical thinking when you're using these tools and over index on, is this the right question to ask constantly, rather than just accepting, oh, that seems like a good question, is going to be a really important skill.
So when we look at the future of real estate, is there any threats out there that people aren't talking about that you're really worried that could impact our future?
Try and think of extreme situations. What would need to happen for them to happen? And if they were to happen like that, how would we counterbalance them? Dario Amodei, boss of Anthropic, the makers of Claude, said 50% of starter jobs will not be required in 2 years' time. In 2 years' time. If that was true, what does that do to the nature of demand for offices? They have an awful lot of juniors in offices, particularly the big firms. They are already dropping their intake of graduates considerably. They might have taken on 1,000 graduates a few years ago. They might be taking 600 this time. What if these tech bros projections actually came to pass? Do I have an asset that would still be relevant when we have AGI or when we have compute 100 times more powerful?
And this is the challenge for the investors right now. We talked about this earlier where investors don't know how to value these things going forward. There's so many uncertainties that you have to value in now, and they've all got burned on WeWork, which for some reason they came up with the valuation of what it was somehow worth,
Yeah.
which never made sense. But now they're coming back and looking at their real estate. Is it going to be an attractive piece of real estate? The other thing we haven't even touched on is the fact that a lot of commercial real estate will become uninsurable because of where it's located going forward
Well,
and the
yes,
problems we have with global warming and the impact on the environment. So, if I'm an investor right now, I'm panicking. I'm thinking I should go back to school and learn how to become an electrician because maybe that's where the money is going to be going forward.
well, you certainly want to be a plumber near me. They're incredibly expensive. But I did hear an interesting thing the other day talking about Miami. If you look at Miami from the climate scientist point of view, it's the most stupid place to be buying real estate. It's just death. The attitude was, well, there's so much money in Miami, they will end up basically building a big wall out at sea, which will hold back the sea. But it is really predicating the future of Miami on being able to build essentially sea defenses and at a scale that can protect the whole city.
Well, if they
And
don't build the sea defenses, they might actually get one anyway, because if buildings keep falling in the
they're,
water, it's going to create a natural defense around them.
you just got to look at the Mediterranean
Mm.
the last couple of years. Becoming commonplace for it to be high 30s, 40 degrees in the summer. What happens to the tourism industry in the summer? Med, when it's 32, is lovely. Going to it when it's 42 and you can't sit outside, it's even too hot to sit around the swimming pool.
In Northern Europe, we're reaping the benefits. We're having a glorious summer. I'm
Yeah.
kind of enjoying it for right now.
I do think that you put all these things together, and yes, it's complicated and slightly scary, but it's super interesting. Sometimes you hear a lot of despair, oh, it's all misery, misery. And I think, hang on a sec. We have all these tools and we have all these problems to solve, and we might now have the technology that would enable us to solve them.
What we can do with technology is amazing, but that doesn't mean it's always been amazing. So this is the last question on this one today. So we've both been around for quite some time and we've seen a lot of overhyped technology over the years. So what's the one that when you hear the term, it still makes your blood boil?
Oh, Metaverse.
Yes.
I hate the
agree.
Metaverse. I hate the Metaverse. I just really dislike because it's such a horrible idea. This is not where we want to be going as people. We do not want to be outsourcing our humanity working in virtual worlds. The giveaway to me was Mark Anderson of A16Z talking about this back in the day when everyone was going on about it, that everyone wearing video goggles and living in the virtual world. He said, yeah, but for lots of us, our lives are really nice, but lots of people have terrible lives. So this is better than their terrible life. And you think you've got all your values the wrong way round, mate.
Accenture put all of their new hires a couple of years ago
Yeah.
through a week in the metaverse. And I saw the images of it, and they basically recreated an office. You had to go in, you had a queue, you had a crappy avatar, and that was supposed to be the future of work. Brilliant. Exactly what we need.
It goes back to my history of art days. I love buildings. I love art. I want to go and see things. I want to be with people. I want to be around beautiful spaces. Who wants to live in that sort of world?
I knew it was going to end as soon as I was working on Neon, and I'll cut this bit out because I know I shouldn't say it, but I was working on Neon and the whole team, they're like, we need the metaverse. I'm like, no, you don't. We need to have the Middle East first metaverse. No, you don't. Actually, you really don't. I'm being honest. You don't need this right now.
I genuinely wonder whether there's a correlation between this sort of thinking and all the problems that are existing now about people being burnt out, being lonely, not having any friends. People have been going back to the office, but they're not connecting with their friends. And you sort of think, are we just losing the innate ability to actually sit down and have a drink? Cheers.
That's what I miss. And the funny thing is, I've spent most of the last 23 years working from home or working on the road, but I've always had my clients and I love spending time with them at their locations. When we had the pandemic, I wanted everybody to go back to work because I missed the idea of like going out for a pint after work and just being able to talk and really find out what's going on, because you don't get those conversations anymore. And it is disappointing. I think the benefit we have is that we're grumpy old men, right? We know how to question these things and not trust them. But if you're coming through and this is what you're learning, you might just think it's normal. Whereas we see what the societal change is actually going to be from this. Anthony, I want to say thank you very much for this lovely conversation about PropTech, real estate, GenAI, and the Metaverse, of course, because we needed to throw a bit of that in there.
It was fun. It was fun. Very enjoyable.
Well, thanks again. And hopefully you'll come back and talk to us again, because I know this AI stuff in commercial real estate is going to be moving quickly. And I want to make sure I'm keeping up to date. So we'll invite you back on again and talk more about it.
It'll be a different world in a year.
Be a different world next week.
Yes, exactly.
Right, thanks again.
Thanks, Charles.